They say the dark is quiet, but I don't think it is. Sometimes it listens back. Where are you right now? And what time is it where you are? Leave it in the comments. Just try to stay still. Sometimes the quiet moves. The dream had not been remembered clearly at first. Like most fragments of sleep, it had slipped away upon waking, washed in morning light and static. But as the day had passed, small moments had returned, not fully, not with detail, but in sensations, in pieces. It had started with a road, not a highway, not a street, just a road, winding, nondescript, caught between trees that had not moved. Two figures had been noticed there. Girls, perhaps, or the silhouettes of girls. Both had worn clothes that had seemed older than the season, fabrics that had not matched the weather. No names had been spoken, and yet an invitation had been given. They had followed. The place they had entered had not been familiar, though it had worn the mask of a house. White walls, stale air, a kitchen with a clock that had never ticked. Everything had seemed suspended, like a photograph developed too long. One of the girls had been curious, especially about the phone. The device had been handed over, screen unlocked, gallery opened. A photo editing app had been shown, not the filters, not the tools, but the liquefy brush, a simple feature meant to warp an image like soft clay. A demonstration had been started, a picture had been loaded, someone's face captured in dim light, expression blank. But before the tool had even been touched, the image had moved, not subtly, not accidentally. The face on the screen had smiled, not gently, not warmly, but with violence, a grin that had stretched far beyond natural width, teeth gleaming, eyes unblinking. The mouth had pulled itself open, pixel by pixel, like muscle tearing from bone. The app had not responded to inputs. The brush had been frozen, and the face had continued to warp itself, without command, without logic, without end. That had been the moment of waking. A breath had been gasped. The light had seemed too bright. The skin had felt clammy, but the room had been still. The phone had been where it always sat. The image had been gone. That afternoon, a video had been played. Background noise. Nothing more. A content creator had been streaming a horror game. Something low resolution, foreign, obscure. The name had been unfamiliar. The visuals low budget. Characters had been blocky. The sound design rough. And yet, at exactly 1929, a character resembling an elderly woman had appeared. By 1932, she had smiled, and the smile had been identical, not similar, the same, too wide, too bright, not rendered, but pulled. The breath had stopped again. The screen had been paused. Screenshots had been taken, zoomed, compared. No differences had been found. And then the memories had started to connect. This had not been the first time. Weeks earlier, perhaps a month, perhaps more, a different dream had occurred. A friend, face vague and warm, had been embraced beneath soft morning light. No words had been exchanged, just warmth, comfort, the kind of embrace that lingered into waking. That very afternoon, as family had left on a trip, a farewell hug had been given by someone else entirely. The angle had been the same, the timing, the pressure, the sensation. A moment repeated, not remembered, anticipated. From that day on, the dreams had been watched more carefully, and so had the days, because somewhere in that space between waking and sleep, something had been waiting, something that smiled. A pattern had begun to form, though it had not been understood at first. Each dream had seemed harmless, almost mundane, nothing like the dramatized nightmares people described. No chasing, no falling, No monsters in closets, just ordinary scenes. Too ordinary, played out with unnatural precision. They had started simple: a road, a room, a voice not quite right, and then the mirror, not in the dreams, but in waking life. Real moments had started to reflect those fragments seen behind closed eyes. Not exactly, but close enough to freeze the blood. Once a streetlight had flickered just as it had in a dream the week before. Once a song on the radio had finished a sentence that had started in a dream. And then a stranger had smiled across a train aisle, with a face that had not been familiar until it had been recognized. Not from waking life, from sleep. The realization had come slowly, over days filled with unease. At first, the connection between the dreams and reality had seemed like coincidence, memory filling in blanks, the mind playing tricks. But eventually, the repetition had become too exact. Not predictions, reflections, as if life had started answering back. The phone had been avoided for a few days, especially the editing app, but eventually curiosity had returned. The screen had been unlocked again, the gallery opened. No changes had been noticed. The images had remained still, until the one photo, the one from the dream, had appeared again. It hadn't been saved before, not intentionally, yet there it was, a portrait slightly blurry, taken in low light, with a person whose features seemed to hover just out of clarity. It had not been remembered being taken, and worse, the face had been smiling. No filters applied, no edits made. The grin had been there, the same grin, the one from the dream, the one from the video, the one from the woman with the torn mouth and glassy stare. And when the metadata of the image had been checked, something had frozen in the chest like ice. Created 2:03 a.m. App used ibis paint X brush. Liquify push. The app had been opened. The tool had been selected. The image had been manipulated. While asleep, or by something else, dreams had continued. But now something had changed. The spaces had become more vivid. The faces more familiar. People from the past had appeared, but slightly off, like puppets trying to remember who they once were. Eyes had remained fixed, movements repeated, smiles forced, and always in the background a girl with no name, watching with a face that shifted slightly each time. She had never spoken, but she had always stared, sometimes from a window, sometimes from behind a door, sometimes from the corner of a reflection, waiting. And the more she had been seen in dreams, the more familiar faces in real life had started to resemble her, just enough to cause a moment of hesitation. A stranger's gait, a customer's posture, the reflection in a bus window that had lasted a moment too long. It had begun to feel like the dream wasn't predicting life anymore. It had started writing it. Sleep had begun to feel dangerous. Each night had brought not rest but rehearsal. Scenes that blurred the line between dream and waking, events that had not yet occurred, but soon would. And with each return to unconsciousness, the girl had stepped closer. Her presence had never been overt. She had never chased, never spoken, never moved beyond the edges of vision. But each night, she had been found closer. At first she had been glimpsed through windows in distant buildings. Then she had been seen standing behind others in the dream. Then in reflections in spoons, puddles, phone screens. Always in the background, but always watching. Her eyes had not blinked. Her smile had remained fixed, slightly too wide, teeth perfectly lined, skin stretched tight. And worse, each time she had been seen, a real-world event had followed. Small things, at first. A spilled glass that mirrored the dream. A message from someone not heard from in months. A scream in the night from nowhere. But then the photo album. One morning, upon waking, the gallery app had shown new images. 6 in total. Each taken at 3:33 a.m. Each one had been a photo of the bedroom, from different angles, No fingerprints had been found. The phone had remained locked. The time had matched the moment the dream had shown her hand reaching out. In one of the photos she had been visible, not clearly, just a shape. In the shadow behind the curtain, a silhouette had formed, a girl with her head tilted slightly, hands at her side, mouth curled into a familiar grin. The photo had been deleted, but the imprint had remained. The dreams had begun to change. They had become less symbolic, more direct. Places once seen in life had been recreated perfectly. A kitchen light that had flickered for months, a crack in the mirror shaped like a hook, even the way the floor creaked near the back door. All had been rendered in painful accuracy. Reality had bled into the dreams, and then the editing had resumed, not intentionally. At first, sleepwalking had been suspected, then automatic app openings, but over the next few days, images in the phone's gallery had been discovered. Self-portraits taken during the night, each one altered by the liquefy tool. The mouth had always been stretched, the eyes had always been wider, and the girl had always been somewhere in the corner. In one image she had stood in the hallway mirror, in another she had been behind the curtain again, and in the last partially corrupted, barely visible, her hand had been pressed to the lens. After that, the phone had been powered off. But even then, her influence had not stopped, because in a shop window 2 days later, her reflection had returned. Same smile, same stillness. And this time, she had not disappeared when the eyes had been closed. Attempts had been made to resist sleep. Windows had been covered, mirrors turned. The phone left powered off and locked inside a drawer lined with salt and prayer. But sleep had come anyway, creeping, not crashing. And this time, no dream had begun, not in the usual way. No road, no house, no friends, no phone, only a white void, pulsing with low frequency, like a hum that lived in the bone. And at the center of that space, she had waited, no longer distant, no longer blurred, just her, standing, smiling, no longer silent. Though her mouth had not moved, her message had been heard, pressed into the skull like heat. Words had not been spoken, yet understood. You looked too long. You smiled back. Now you're mine to frame. The next morning, the phone had been found unlocked again. The gallery had shown a new folder, hidden, not by encryption, but by instinct. It had been labeled Canvas. Inside, hundreds of photos had waited. Each one had shown a person smiling. Some had been strangers. Some had been family. Others had been younger versions of the viewer themselves, posed in places never visited, wearing clothes never owned, all of them smiling with her mouth, the same too-wide grin, the same wet, glassy eyes, the same impossible curve to the jaw, as if the face had been pulled open by invisible strings. And in the metadata of every file, a familiar timestamp had appeared. 3:33 a.m. Life had not returned to normal. Not after that. The faces of others had begun to shift slightly, like masks misaligned. Photos taken by strangers had occasionally shown distortions, smiles where none had been posed, eyes reflecting more than light. Mirrors had started to warp reflections. Glass surfaces had trembled faintly when passed, but the worst had come weeks later. In a moment of weakness, curiosity had returned. The app had been opened. Just once, the liquefy tool had been selected, just to see, and in the gallery, a new photo had already been waiting, a self-portrait, not taken, not staged, but already altered, already warped, already smiling. The grin had stretched ear to ear, flesh rippling, as if animated by someone else's hand, and in the reflection of the eye, her face had been seen, half there, half outside the image, as though peering through the screen itself, watching, waiting, framing, and from then on, every dream had started with her already inside the room. In a forgotten corner of a coastal city, in a building worn thin by salt air and time, a man had lived alone on the third floor. The structure had leaned ever so slightly toward the sea, its bricks soft with erosion, its windows dusted with the breath of the tides. From his balcony, the man had observed a neighboring structure across the narrow street, a house long abandoned, sealed and left to rot. The house had stood like a monument to neglect. Its wooden frame had blackened with mildew, its windows shattered into jagged mouths. The front door had been chained and padlocked years ago, and ivy had begun its slow, inevitable takeover. No light had entered it. No footsteps had crossed its porch. The building had been forgotten, dismissed by passers-by as an empty husk. And then, one night, something had changed. It had begun simply. A late hour, a cigarette nearly done, the sky indifferent above. A glance, unthinking, had been cast toward the ruin across the street. A figure had been seen. It had stood atop the roof, upright, still, facing the stars. The shape had been ordinary at first glance. A man, not tall, not short, dressed in simple clothing, a shirt, dark pants, something indistinct at the feet. The posture had not suggested danger, only stillness. But that stillness had unsettled something deep within the observer. The man's head had been tilted back, not at a relaxed angle, but far back, unnaturally so. Throat exposed to the sky, chin raised until the mouth could no longer be seen. Only the jawline and the glint of something pale where the forehead should have been. No movement had followed. The figure had remained frozen for long minutes, untouched by wind or time. The street below had lain quiet, the lamplight stretching long shadows across the crumbling bricks. And eventually, the observer had gone inside, shutting the balcony door a little faster than usual. The next night, the figure had returned. Same place, same posture, same silence. And so it had continued. Each night, without fail, the figure had stood on the same stretch of sagging rooftop, staring skyward with rigid devotion. No neighbors had mentioned it. No lights had turned on across the way. No signs of life had stirred in or around the abandoned home. Inquiries had been made. The building's caretaker, a man with faded tattoos and tired eyes, had confirmed what was already suspected. The house had been closed for decades. No access existed. The stairwell inside had collapsed during a storm years prior. The roof had not been deemed safe even for pigeons. Others in the neighborhood had echoed the same. Stories of old deaths, of insurance disputes, of ghost stories murmured between children. But none had seen anyone enter. None had seen anyone standing. None had seen the man. Only one set of eyes had witnessed him. Night after night, and the man across the rooftops had never moved. Over time, obsession had replaced fear. The ritual had become routine. Blinds had been parted just enough to see without being seen. Eyes had adjusted to the dark. Details had been memorized. The weight of the figure's stillness had begun to settle over every hour, even the daylight ones. Sleep had thinned. Meals had been skipped. Time had stretched. No matter how many times the scene had been replayed, no answers had been found. The figure had never entered or exited. He had simply been, always at the same time, always in the same pose, and never once had he looked down until the night something had been thrown. Not in anger, not in violence, only in desperation. A stone, small and smooth, had been cast gently toward the roof. It had landed without echo. No shattering, no sharp collision, only a thud, and then motion. Not abrupt, not startled, but slow, mechanical, deliberate. The head had lowered, vertebra by vertebra, until its unseen face had faced forward, and the light in its eyes, had begun to shine. The light had not flickered, it had not flashed, it had poured outward, steady, cold and colorless, like the kind used in sterile rooms or over operating tables. From the rooftop across the street, where the figure had stood for countless nights without motion, two beams had been cast, not reflected, not bounced, but emitted. Where eyes should have been, light had lived, and for the first time, the watcher had been watched. There had been no expression to read, no twitch of the mouth, no furrow of the brow, only the tilt of the head and the light cutting through the darkness like blades through fog. The face behind it had remained a void, and yet contact had been felt, as if a weight had shifted, as if something once passive had noticed it had become an object of study and had decided to return the favor. The reaction had been immediate. Curtains had been yanked closed, doors locked, lights dimmed. A primal instinct, centuries old, had taken hold. Hide, close every exit, block every eye. A child's fear, newly awakened in an adult body that had known logic, had now been overtaken by something deeper. Belief, not belief in spirits, but belief in danger. For the first time, the balcony had not been approached the following night, nor the next. The shape had not been sought again, but its presence had not been denied. It had not required line of sight to be felt. Something heavy had remained in the air, pressing on the windows, vibrating faintly through the walls, seeping into the spine. The observer had stayed hidden, but the sense of being seen had not disappeared. Every corner had started to feel too sharp, every silence too long, every shadow just a little too deep. Then had come the second sighting, not across the street, but closer. A fleeting glance had caught it, movement atop the adjacent building, a blur in the periphery. When the eyes had focused, it had already stopped. Same posture, same tilt of the head, same absence of motion. But now, less than 20 feet away, no stone had been thrown this time, no sound made, and still, the head had begun to turn, not fast, not jerking, but with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. Again, the light had returned, blinding, sharp, a white, too pure to be found in nature. A light not meant to illuminate, but to pierce. A slit had opened in the night, and through it, that gaze had been delivered. It had not left after that. Even with the blinds shut, the sense of presence had remained. The air had thickened. Electrical devices had begun to behave strangely. Phones had refused to charge. Clocks had reset. Screens had shown nothing but static at random intervals. A sense of being searched had spread through every room. The apartment had become an X-ray flesh, laid bare beneath invisible hands. Nothing had been touched, and yet everything had felt handled. Sleep had stopped coming. Not because of noise, but because of expectation. Each time the eyelids had drifted closed, the memory of the light had returned. Not the way it had looked, but the way it had felt. Not warmth, not even cold, but the sensation of being replaced by something else's focus. It had not felt like being looked at. It had felt like being measured. And then, something worse. The realization that the balcony door had not been fully latched that night, that for a moment, however brief, a way in had existed. The door had been locked, but not before, only after the light had vanished, after the rooftop had been found empty, after the figure had left no trace, not even a shoe print on the neighboring ledge. The lock had been turned in panic, hands trembling, breath shallow, and yet the air inside had felt different, not stirred, but altered, as though something had passed through without moving anything. That night, the shadows in the apartment had lingered longer than usual. Corners had darkened too fast. The hallway light had flickered once, then settled, but the walls had felt closer, the air heavier. The temperature had dropped slightly, imperceptibly, but enough to make breath fog for a second. And in the silence, something had been heard. Not a voice, not footsteps, but breathing. Not loud, not heavy, just slow, steady, as if someone were sleeping in the same room. A rhythm out of sync with the observer's own faint, but undeniable. The source had never been found. No closets had been opened that night, no mirrors checked, no lights turned back on. Instead, stillness had been met with stillness, as if any movement might draw attention again. The curtains had remained sealed, the phone silenced, and the figure across the street had not been looked for again. But that had changed nothing. The line had already been crossed. 2 days later, a strange distortion had been noticed in the living room mirror. Not a crack, just a slight curve, as though the reflection were shifting a few degrees away from reality. At first, it had been dismissed as tiredness, but when the hallway had been passed again, that night, something else had been seen in the mirror. A second set of shoulders, behind the reflection, motionless, perfectly aligned with the dark. No shape had been visible when turning around, only in the glass, just for a second, then gone. From then on, devices had started recording on their own. The phone's camera roll had filled with brief, black videos, half-second clips, always silent, always taken at night. Some had been of the wall, others of the hallway, one, inexplicably, of the balcony from the outside, as if the phone had been filming through the glass, not from inside it. The timestamp of that video had matched the exact time when the dream of the figure stepping down from the rooftop had occurred. But the most disturbing file had come a day later, an audio recording only 12 seconds long. Most of it had been static, but in the final moment, a whisper had been layered beneath the hiss. Not words, just breath and the slight tremble of air through teeth, like someone trying to learn how to speak, just inches away from the microphone. No audio apps had been opened, no permissions had been granted. The phone had never left the nightstand, and yet the voice had been recorded from inside the bedroom. No figure had returned to the rooftop, because now it no longer needed to. After the audio had been heard, silence had become unbearable. Every object had begun to feel like an eye. The walls had seemed to lean inward. The flat's geometry had grown uncertain. Angles slightly off, lines no longer straight, shadows pooling where none should be. Even the breath of the room had changed. It had not been paranoia, it had been recognition, as if the space itself had started to remember something it had once forgotten. Sleep had come in fragments, in patches of dreamless dark, and yet, upon waking, the body had always been turned toward the balcony door, no matter how sleep had begun. On the sofa, curled sideways or buried in blankets, each awakening had come with the eyes facing that single spot. Sometimes the lock had been found undone. Once, the curtain had been lifted a few centimeters. Nothing had been taken, but something had entered. On the 7th day, a thin line of ash had been discovered on the kitchen floor. A footprint, perfectly shaped, bare, facing inward. A second line had followed the next night, but facing a different direction. No smell had accompanied it. No soot from above, just the imprint of something that had stood, turned and stepped away. And after that, the mirrors had gone dark. Reflections had stopped working. To surfaces had returned only blankness, not black, but a dim gray, like staring into still water under ice. No image had been returned, no light reflected, just an endless layer of stillness that no longer recognized what stood before it. The man who had once stood on the roof had not been seen again, not outside, not physically, but glimpses had begun to flicker in the corner of every thought. A pale shape behind eyelids, a sound behind silence, a weight behind the spine, and with it had come a growing suspicion that the figure had never been a man, that it had never truly looked at the sky, that the sky had been looking through him. The lights had begun to flicker only in one room, always the bedroom, never completely off, never completely on, a pulse, like breath. One night, upon entering, something had been seen, a shape, not moving, not reacting, just standing in the corner facing the wall. It had been tall, barefoot, and light. The same cold white light had pulsed faintly from the space between its shoulder blades. The door had been closed without sound. No attempt to wake had been made that night. Weeks had passed, then months. Neighbors had stopped seeing the man on the balcony. Mail had stopped being collected. Inside, the space had fallen quiet. Furniture had remained untouched, curtains sealed, lights off. But every so often, just after sunset, an apartment window on the third floor had shown two thin beams of light, cast across the room from inside, pointed upward at the ceiling, unmoving, as though someone had been standing perfectly still, head tilted back, eyes raised, just watching, like before. Only now it had been from this side of the glass.